There is a moment, somewhere in the early 16th century, when the world became larger. Not because any new land had been drawn on a map, though many had been, not because any king had signed any treaty, or any explorer had planted any flag in foreign soil. The world became larger because a ship was built. And not just any ship, a ship that looked, to every eye that first beheld her, like something that should not exist, like something that had grown out of the ocean itself, vast and dark and unhurried, as though the sea had finally decided to build something worthy of its own depths. That ship was the Galleon. She did not arrive quietly. Nothing of that scale ever does. But what is remarkable, what separates the Galleon from every vessel that came before her, is how long she stayed. For nearly 2 centuries, she would define what power looked like on the open water. She would carry empires on her back. She would sink beneath storms that swallowed lesser ships whole. And she would survive. She would be hunted, boarded, burned, and celebrated. She would carry gold, unimaginable quantities of gold, and she would, in doing so, draw to the ocean an entire world of men who wanted nothing more than to take it from her. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. As the Galleon herself would teach you, patience is not a weakness, it is architecture. To understand the Galleon, you must first understand the ships she replaced. In the early 1500s, the dominant vessel of the European sea lanes was the carrack, a wide, round-bellied ship, built for cargo rather than grace. The carrack was dependable in the way that a barn is dependable. She held things, she floated, she moved, slowly when the wind cooperated. A high, towering forecastle, that castle-like structure rising from her bow, caught the wind like a sail itself, pushing her sideways and backward in ways her crew could only partially correct. She was not built to be fast. She was not built to be nimble. She was built to survive, and on most days she managed it. The caravels that sailed alongside her were smaller, quicker, more responsive. The ships that had carried Columbus and da Gama to the edges of the known world. But they were limited. You could navigate a caravel with extraordinary skill. You could not move an empire with one. Spain needed something else. Something that could cross the Atlantic, not once, not experimentally, but reliably, year after year, season after season, carrying enormous weight in both directions, carrying silver from the mines of Peru, carrying soldiers to the colonies, carrying the architecture of empire itself, piece by piece, across 3,000 miles of open ocean. And so, beginning in the shipyards of northern Spain, in the Basque country, where the oak forests ran deep and the craftsmen had been building hulls for generations, something new began to take shape. The Galleon was, in essence, a refinement, a long, careful, deliberate answer to every weakness the carrack possessed. Her hull was longer and lower, reducing the windage that had plagued her predecessor. Her forecastle was cut back, no longer towering above the bow like a cathedral facade, but receding. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider following our show as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Becoming part of the ship rather than fighting against it. Her stern, however, rose, tall and squared and decorated, housing the captain's quarters, the officers' cabins, and the navigational instruments that made long ocean crossings possible. She carried 3 masts, sometimes 4. Her sails were arranged to work with the wind from multiple directions. She was, by the standards of her time, not fast, but she was steady. In the long, rhythmic swells of the open Atlantic, she found her stride. And once she found it, almost nothing could stop her. Along her flanks, cut into the hull itself, were the gun ports, square wooden mouths that opened to reveal the bronze and iron artillery within. The Galleon was not merely a cargo ship. She was a weapons platform, a floating fortress that could, when provoked, turn the sea around her into something no enemy admiral wanted to experience. This was the ship that would come to define the Spanish Main, that vast stretch of Caribbean and Atlantic water where Spain's treasure fleets made their slow, magnificent passage twice a year, laden with the wealth of an entire hemisphere. And it was here, on these particular waters, in this particular era, that the Galleon would have her greatest and most consequential chapter. Because wherever great wealth moves slowly through open water, other men will come to watch it pass. And some of them will not be content to simply watch. The story of the Galleon is, in the end, a story about what happens when the world's most powerful nation decides to move its fortune across the sea, and the extraordinary age of danger, adventure, and legend that decision unleashed. Even today, standing at the edge of one, watching the slow assembly of something enormous, piece by piece, from the ground up, there is a quality to the work that feels ancient, deliberate, the kind of labor that does not hurry because it cannot afford to. A ship is not a building. A building, if it fails, stays where it falls. A ship, if it fails, takes everyone inside it to the bottom of the sea. And so the men who built ships understood, in a way that few craftsmen in history have ever had to, that the quality of their work was the same thing as the survival of other men's lives. In 16th century Spain, this understanding was everywhere in the shipyards. The Basque coast of northern Spain, the provinces of Guipúzcoa and Vizcaya, was the heartland of Spanish shipbuilding. The region had been producing skilled mariners and master carpenters for centuries before the Galleon existed, drawn to the sea not by romance but by necessity. The land here was mountainous, the soil thin, the farming difficult. The ocean was not a backdrop, it was a livelihood, and the forests that ran down from the Pyrenees and the Cantabrian mountains, dense with the kind of slow-grown oak that produces the tightest grain and the hardest wood, were, for the shipbuilders of this coast, what the mines of Potosi would become for the Spanish crown, the source of everything. Oak was the Galleon's primary material, and not just any oak. Shipbuilders selected their timber the way a surgeon selects an instrument, with precision, with patience, and with an understanding that the wrong choice carried consequences that could not be undone. The curved pieces, called compass timber, were the most prized and the most difficult to find. These were the naturally bent sections of trunk and branch that, when shaped and fitted, would form the ribs of the ship. Her internal skeleton, the curved frames that gave the hull its form and its strength. A straight tree, however magnificent, was of limited use for these pieces. What the shipbuilder wanted was a tree that had grown crooked, that had bent around something in its youth and hardened that way, because nature had already done the difficult work of forming the shape he needed. Scouts would walk the forests for days, marking trees, studying the angle of their growth, cutting test sections to examine the grain. It was slow work. It was essential work. And it was work that could not be rushed, because the timber, once cut, needed to season, to dry slowly over months and sometimes years before it could be shaped and fitted. Green wood moved. Green wood cracked. Green wood could split under the pressure of deep water in ways that ended voyages before they truly began. The keel was laid first. This was the spine of the ship, a single long beam of the densest, straightest oak available, running the entire length of the hull from stem to stern. In a large galleon, this keel might run 60, 70, 80 feet or more. Onto it the frames were raised, the curved ribs arcing upward on both sides, one by one, forming the shape of the hull like the bones of some great sea creature being assembled from the inside out. Between the frames, thick planks of oak were fastened with wooden tree nails, pegs driven into bored holes, which swelled when they met water and locked the joint tighter than any iron nail could manage. The seams between planks were caulked with oakum, rope fiber teased apart and hammered deep into every gap, then sealed with hot tar. The underwater sections of the hull were sometimes sheathed in lead or in an early form of protective planking to slow the relentless work of the teredo worm, that small, devastating creature that bored through unprotected wood with a patience that rivaled the shipbuilders themselves. A ship that neglected her hull in warm tropical waters could be rendered structurally unsound in a matter of months. The teredo worm cared nothing for the wealth she carried. It simply ate. The masts were stepped, fitted into their positions, once the hull was largely complete. The mainmast of a large galleon was a construction in itself, because no single tree grew tall enough to serve. It was built in sections, bound with iron hoops, the lower mast rising from the keel through the decks to the open air, the topmast fitted above it, and the topgallant mast above that, each section narrower and lighter than the one beneath, the whole assembly tapering toward the sky like a cathedral spire designed to catch the wind rather than point toward heaven. Rigging followed, miles of it, hemp rope of varying thicknesses, each line with a specific name and a specific function. The entire system so intricate that a skilled sailor navigating a galleon's rigging in darkness, by memory, by feel, by the sound of the wind in the lines, was performing a feat of physical memory that few trades have ever demanded of their practitioners. The standing rigging held the masts in place. The running rigging controlled the sails, and the sails themselves. Vast sheets of heavy canvas, hand-sewn by sailmakers who worked in long lofts on shore, could together cover an area larger than many of the houses the sailors had grown up in. By the time a galleon was complete, she represented something staggering, not just in the labor she had consumed, though that was immense, involving hundreds of workers across months or years of construction, but in the knowledge she embodied. Every decision made in her building reflected a tradition of understanding that had accumulated over generations. The angle of her hull, the depth of her keel, the placement of her gun ports, high enough above the waterline to be useful, low enough that too much cargo wouldn't raise the center of gravity and make her unstable in heavy seas. The relationship between the length of her hull and the breadth of her beam, a ratio that shipbuilders adjusted by intuition and experience, because the mathematics to calculate it precisely did not yet exist. These men were not scientists, but they were something equally remarkable, practitioners of an extraordinarily sophisticated empirical tradition, building complex systems from accumulated wisdom rather than formal theory. And the ships they produced, at their best, were among the most capable ocean-going vessels the world had yet seen. A fully laden galleon of the mid-16th century might displace 500 tons. A larger one, the great galleons that anchored the treasure fleets of the following century, might reach 1,000 tons or more. She would carry dozens of cannon, ranging from small swivel guns mounted on her rails to heavy bronze pieces capable of hurling an iron ball the size of a man's head across several hundred yards of water with devastating effect. She would carry a crew of 200 men, sometimes far more. Sailors, soldiers, gunners, cooks, surgeons, priests. Because a galleon was never merely a ship, she was a community, a floating world, and she might be at sea for months before she saw land again. To understand where the galleon would sail and why, you must understand what Spain had found on the other side of the Atlantic. The Americas, in the 16th century, were not simply a new territory. They were, for Spain, something closer to a geological miracle. The silver mines of Potosi, in present-day Bolivia, were among the richest ore deposits the human world had ever encountered. Beginning in 1545, they began producing silver in quantities that strained the imagination. Estimates suggest that over the following 2 centuries, Potosi alone produced something in the range of 40,000 tons of silver, a figure so large It effectively reshaped the global economy. Prices rose across Europe. Trade routes shifted. The entire monetary system of the known world was altered by the output of a single Andean mountain. And all of it had to get home. This was the Galleon's central purpose. Not exploration. That work had largely been done. Not conquest. The soldiers and the horsemen had handled that in their terrible fashion on the ground. The Galleon's purpose was logistics, the movement of wealth. And it was a purpose that demanded regularity, reliability, and security on a scale that no previous maritime operation had attempted. The Spanish crown's answer was the floater system, the treasure fleet. Twice yearly, convoys of galleons would assemble at Seville, later Cadiz, and sail together across the Atlantic. One fleet, the Flota de Nueva España, was bound for Veracruz on the Mexican coast. The other, the Flota de Tierra Firme, sailed to Cartagena and Portobello on the coast of South America. At these ports, the silver and gold that had been accumulating in colonial warehouses, carried overland by mule train from the mines of Peru and Mexico, was loaded onto the galleons. The fleets would then rendezvous at Havana, in Cuba, gathering their strength before making the long homeward passage together through the Florida Straits and then northeast across the open Atlantic. It was a system of breathtaking ambition, and it worked. Not perfectly, not without terrible losses to storms and misfortune, but well enough, consistently enough, to sustain the Spanish Empire for the better part of 2 centuries. The treasure that moved along these routes was not merely valuable, it was the financial lifeblood of a global power. It funded armies in Europe, wars in the Mediterranean, cathedrals and palaces, and the entire vast apparatus of imperial administration. Without the flota, Spain was diminished. Without the galleons that made it possible, the flota did not exist. And so the galleons sailed. Season after season, year after year, they made their slow passage through the warm Caribbean waters, through straits lined with islands, past coastlines thick with jungle, across channels where the trade winds blew reliably from the east, and the sea ran a particular shade of blue that sailors who had made the passage before would recognize from miles away. They were not invisible. They could not be. A convoy of a dozen galleons, their sails spread wide in the Caribbean sun, their flags streaming above the highest masts, was a sight visible from considerable distance, and the men who watched them pass, from the low coastlines of the islands, from the decks of smaller vessels, from the edges of hidden harbors where other kinds of ships were moored, understood exactly what they were looking at. They were looking at wealth beyond calculation, moving slowly through open water, protected by cannon and soldiers and the authority of the most powerful crown in the world. And they were calculating quietly the distance between that wealth and themselves. Oh, it is the hunger that comes from standing at the edge of something enormous and understanding, with complete clarity, that you are not permitted to touch it, that it belongs to someone else, to a king, to a crown, to an empire, and that the distance between you and it is not merely physical, it is moral, it is moral. It is enforced by canon and by law and by the full weight of the most powerful nation on earth, watching from across an ocean. This was the hunger that the galleon created in the Caribbean, not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, over the decades that followed Spain's establishment of her treasure routes, a feeling settled over the islands and coastlines of that warm and beautiful sea, a feeling that the world had been arranged unfairly, and that the arrangement was not as permanent as Spain believed. To understand it fully, you must understand what Spain had actually claimed. In 1494, 2 years after Columbus made his first landfall in the Bahamas, the Pope, acting as the supreme arbiter of Christian nations, issued the Treaty of Tordesillas. This remarkable document divided the entire non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal. A line was drawn down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Everything to the west of it belonged to Spain. Everything to the east belonged to Portugal. The Americas, in their entirety, their coastlines, their interiors, their peoples, their resources, the staggering mineral wealth beneath their mountains, were declared the sovereign property of the Spanish crown. The rest of Europe was not consulted. France was not consulted. England was not consulted. The Netherlands, which did not yet exist as an independent nation but would, was not consulted. And these omissions were not accidental. They were the point. Spain and Portugal, the two great maritime powers of the 15th century, had arranged the world between themselves, and they expected the arrangement to hold. It did not hold. It could not hold. Not because the other nations of Europe lacked respect for papal authority, though that respect was eroding, particularly after the Protestant Reformation began fracturing the Christian world in 1517, but because the wealth that Spain was extracting from her American territories was simply too visible, too enormous, and too consequential to ignore. When a Spanish treasure fleet returned to Seville, it did not arrive quietly. The docking of the floaters was a public event, a commercial event of the first magnitude, with merchants, bankers, and crown agents assembled to receive and assess the cargo. The quantities of silver and gold unloaded from these ships were recorded, discussed, and widely known. Europe's financial markets responded to the arrival of the floater, the way later centuries would respond to crop reports or interest rate decisions. The galleons were not a secret. They were the beating heart of a global economy, and every king in Europe could count. France moved first. French corsairs, licensed privateers operating with the informal approval of the French crown, which maintained plausible deniability about their activities while quietly sharing in their profits, began raiding Spanish shipping in the Atlantic as early as the 1520s. These were not pirates in the romantic sense that history would later construct. They were businessmen with swords, entrepreneurs of violence, operating within a loose legal framework that distinguished between piracy, which was simply theft at sea, condemned by all nations, and privateering, which was theft at sea conducted on behalf of a sovereign, which was considered, at least by the sovereign in question, to be a form of warfare. The distinction mattered to the men who drew it. It mattered somewhat less to the crews of the Spanish ships being boarded. In 1523, a French corsair named Jean Fleury intercepted two Spanish caravels off the coast of Portugal. The ships were carrying a portion of the treasure that Hernán Cortés had looted from the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, gold and jewels and featherwork and objects of such extraordinary craftsmanship that when they arrived in Europe, they reportedly reduced the painter Albrecht Dürer to silence. Fleury took it all. The haul was so spectacular that it caused a sensation across Europe, and it delivered a message that every court from London to Amsterdam quietly received. The Spanish treasure routes were not invulnerable. This was the crack in the wall, small at first, barely visible, but over the following century, through that crack would pour an entire world. Privateers and pirates, English sea dogs and Dutch freebooters, French buccaneers and stateless adventurers from half the nations of Europe, all of them drawn toward the warm blue waters of the Caribbean by the same gravitational pull that the galleons, heavy with silver, exerted on everything around them. England arrived at the party with characteristic deliberateness. For much of the early 16th century, England was too small, too poor, and too consumed by its own internal religious convolutions to seriously challenge Spain on the open sea. Henry VIII had dreams of naval power, but limited resources to sustain them. The break with Rome in the 1530s, while it set England on a different spiritual path, also isolated her diplomatically at precisely the moment when she most needed allies. But Elizabeth I, who came to the throne in 1558, and would reign for 45 years, understood something about sea power that her predecessors had only partially grasped. She understood that a nation without the means to challenge a rival directly could still accomplish a great deal through men who operated, officially, at arm's length from the crown. The Elizabethan privateers were a remarkable collection of human beings. John Hawkins, merchant, slaver, naval architect, and sometime raider, was among the first to probe the edges of Spain's Caribbean monopoly, attempting to trade illegally with Spanish colonists who wanted English goods and were officially forbidden from purchasing them. When trade failed, as it often did under Spanish pressure, other methods followed. Francis Drake came after Hawkins, and he came with a different disposition entirely. Drake had been present at San Juan de Ulua in 1568, when a Spanish fleet caught Hawkins's squadron in a Mexican harbor and destroyed most of it in what the English considered a catastrophic betrayal of a negotiated truce. He had watched men he knew die in the water or on the decks of burning ships. He had escaped on a vessel so overcrowded that he had, by some accounts, been forced to put men ashore on the Mexican coast simply to keep the ship afloat, abandoning them to a fate in Spanish territory that would have been, at best, uncertain. He did not forget Drake's subsequent career, raiding Panama, capturing the Silver Mule train at Nombre de Dios, circling the entire globe between 1577 and 1580, returning to England with a hold full of Spanish treasure and a reputation that made him the most celebrated Englishman of his generation, was shaped entirely by that early wound. He was not merely greedy, though the profits of his raids were enormous. He was motivated by something older and more reliable than greed. He was motivated by grievance, and grievance, properly cultivated, is an extraordinarily durable fuel. Elizabeth knighted him on the deck of his own ship. Spain demanded his head. Elizabeth offered apologies with one hand and accepted her share of the plunder with the other. This was how the age worked. Publicly, the major powers of Europe maintained the fiction of peace and respect for one another's territorial claims. Privately, they sharpened their knives and sent men like Drake to press the blade quietly against Spain's most vulnerable artery. But for every Drake, celebrated, connected, sailing with royal letters of marque that gave his raids at least the color of legality, there were dozens of men operating with no such authorization. Pure pirates, men who had crossed a line from which they could not return, and had decided, in crossing it, to go as far as their nerve and their skill and their luck would take them. The Caribbean in the latter half of the 16th century was not yet the pirate world that history tends to imagine. That world, the world of Blackbeard and Calico Jack, of Nassau and Tortuga, of the Jolly Roger and the golden age of piracy, was still a century away. But its foundations were being laid, piece by piece, in the decades when the galleons first established their regular passage through these waters. The islands themselves played a role that is easy to underestimate. The Caribbean is not a single body of water. It is an archipelago, a vast scatter of islands, large and small, stretching in a loose arc from the southern tip of Florida to the coast of Venezuela. Some of these islands Spain had settled and fortified. Others she had visited, found unprofitable, and largely ignored, judging them too small, too dry, or too distant from the main trade routes to merit the expense of colonization. These ignored islands became, in time, a geography of freedom for men who had no other options. Tortuga, a small island off the northern coast of Hispaniola, was one such place. By the early 17th century, it had become the base of the buccaneers, a word derived from the French boucanier, meaning a man who smokes and cures meat in the manner of the Caribbean indigenous peoples, on a wooden frame called a boucan. These were, initially, not pirates at all. They were hunters, rough men, mostly French, who had settled on the edges of Hispaniola and made their living hunting the wild cattle and pigs that the Spanish had introduced to the island, and then abandoned when they had moved on to more profitable territories. Spain, periodically, attempted to drive them out. Spanish troops raided their settlements, burned their camps, killed their cattle deliberately to deprive them of their livelihood. Spain's strategic logic was sound. Ungoverned men on ungoverned islands created ungoverned problems. But the result of these raids was not the orderly elimination of a nuisance. The result was the transformation of hunters into something considerably more dangerous. Men who have nothing left to lose are not men who go home. They are men who go to sea. The buccaneers who took to the water in the middle decades of the 17th century were not refined adversaries. They lacked the naval discipline of the privateers. They did not carry royal commissions. They did not operate within even the loose legal framework that gave men like Drake their partial respectability. They operated on a principle so simple, it was almost philosophical, that the wealth moving through these waters was not Spain's by right, but merely by force, and that anyone with sufficient force of their own could claim their share of it. They were surprisingly effective. Their ships were typically small, fast, shallow-drafted vessels that could operate in waters where a galleon could not follow. They understood the Caribbean intimately, its currents, its hidden anchorages, its shoals and reefs, and the particular quality of its squalls, which could appear from clear skies with almost no warning, and disperse just as quickly. They could chase a merchant vessel and catch her. They could avoid a naval patrol and lose it. They could, in sufficient numbers, board and take a ship that should have been able to defend herself, using speed and shock and the sheer recklessness of men who had decided that death at sea was no worse than the slow destruction of the life they had already lost. The Galleon watched all of this from her considerable height. She was aware of the threat, in the sense that her designers had always been aware of it. The gun ports cut into her flanks were not decorative. The soldiers quartered between decks were not passengers. The convoy system, the entire logic of the floater, assembling ships together so that their collective firepower would deter any attacker, was a direct acknowledgement that the treasure she carried made her a target of extraordinary appeal. And, for most of her history, the system worked. A full treasure fleet of the 16th or early 17th century was a formidable thing. A dozen or more galleons, moving together, their gun decks capable of delivering a combined broadside that would reduce any attacking vessel to splinters. This was not a target that any sensible pirate or privateer would approach directly. The great Spanish flotas were almost never attacked while sailing together. The losses they suffered, and they suffered many, came overwhelmingly from storms rather than from enemies. The Atlantic hurricane season was a far more reliable destroyer of Spanish treasure than any English privateer. This was the galleon's particular tragedy, repeated across the decades. Not defeat in battle, but erasure by weather. Ships that had survived the shipyards, the Atlantic crossing, the careful loading of silver in Caribbean harbors, the assembly of the fleet, the weeks of careful navigation through the Florida Straits. Ships that had done everything correctly could be taken at the very last moment by a storm that bore no grievance and acknowledged no authority, that simply arrived as nature arrives, without warning and without mercy, and took what it wanted. The seafloor of the Caribbean and the Florida coast is littered with the evidence of these moments. Silver coins, green with centuries of salt water, scattered across sand in patterns that preserve, if you know how to read them, the final seconds of a ship's existence. The way the hull broke, the direction the cargo scattered, the last geography of something that had been, until that moment, the most powerful vessel that civilization could produce. And somewhere in those scattered coins, if you look carefully, you can still read the ghost of an empire, still read the outline of the world that built those ships and sent them out and waited for them to come home. Indo, not the galleon as history tends to present her. Frozen in a painting, sails perfectly full, flags streaming, the sun catching the gilded carvings on her stern in the way that only painters and romantics ever seem to manage. Imagine her as she actually was, as the men who sailed her actually experienced her. It is 3 in the morning. The ship is 6 weeks out of Seville. The The Atlantic has been, for this crossing, on this particular voyage, cooperative. The swells are long and regular, the kind that a well-built ship absorbs without drama, rising and falling in a slow rhythm that veteran sailors barely notice and new ones never quite stop noticing. The stars are extraordinary out here, away from any coast, away from any city. The Milky Way is not a suggestion, but a presence, a broad river of light that experienced navigators read the way a scholar reads a page, finding in it direction and latitude, and the particular quality of position that only comes from being genuinely, completely at sea. On deck, the watch moves quietly. A helmsman holds the great whipstaff, the vertical lever connected to the rudder, making small, constant corrections, keeping the compass needle where the pilot has told him to keep it. Another man stands in the bow, watching the darkness ahead for things that should not be there. Reefs, other ships. The first suggestion of land. The rest of the watch move through the rigging above, adjusting lines, reading the sails by sound and feel, performing the endless small maintenance that keeps a working ship in condition. Below decks, in the spaces between the cannon and the cargo, 200 men are sleeping. The word sleeping is generous. The interior of a galleon was not designed for comfort. It was designed for function, for cargo, for cannon, for the storage of provisions sufficient to sustain a large crew across months of ocean passage. Human beings were accommodated in the spaces left over after these priorities had been satisfied, which was to say, not very comfortably at all. Ordinary sailors, the marineros who worked the sails and the lines, had no assigned sleeping quarters in any meaningful sense. They slept where they could, in hammocks slung between deck beams, or on coiled rope, or simply on the bare planking, wrapped in whatever they owned. The smell of a galleon below decks was something that no account of the period fails to mention. A dense, accumulated compound of bilge water, unwashed bodies, tar, salt, damp wood, livestock, and the particular staleness of air that has been breathed by too many people in too small a space for too many consecutive weeks. It was, by all contemporary descriptions, extraordinary. Sailors who had spent years at sea no longer noticed it. Everyone else noticed nothing else. The soldiers, the infantrymen who traveled aboard the galleons to defend the cargo and conduct any land operations required at the colonial ports, were quartered separately in the lower deck spaces, which were marginally more organized but no more comfortable. The relationship between sailors and soldiers aboard a galleon was a subject of perennial tension. The sailors regarded the soldiers as passengers who consumed provisions, got in the way during maneuvers, and contributed nothing to the actual operation of the ship. The soldiers regarded the sailors as rough, godless men, barely fit for Christian company. Both groups were probably correct in their assessments, and they managed their coexistence with the grudging tolerance of people who have no other options. The officers lived differently. The stern castle of a galleon, that tall, elaborately decorated structure rising above the main deck, contained the cabins of the captain, the pilot, the master, and the senior officers. These spaces were small by any land standard, but palatial by comparison with what lay forward. A captain's cabin might contain a proper bunk, a desk, charts, navigational instruments, a chest for personal belongings, and a window. The great stern windows of a galleon, those tall panes of leaded glass that let in light and air, and the view of the ship's own wake, were among the most coveted features of any vessel. To stand at a galleon's stern windows and look out across the water was to understand, viscerally, what it meant to be in command of something moving through an enormous world. The pilot was, in many ways, the most important man on the ship. More important, in purely practical terms, than the captain, who held the authority but often lacked the specific technical knowledge that the pilot possessed. Navigation in the 16th and 17th centuries was an art that sat at the precise boundary between science and intuition, and the pilots who practiced it at the highest level were men of remarkable capability. They worked with a small suite of instruments, the magnetic compass, which had been in use for centuries but which still carried the persistent complication of magnetic variation, the difference between magnetic north and true north, which changes depending on where on the Earth's surface you are standing, and which, if unaccounted for, would slowly walk a ship off its intended course over a long passage. The astrolabe or cross staff, used to measure the altitude of the sun or stars above the horizon, from which latitude could be calculated with reasonable accuracy. And dead reckoning, the practice of tracking position by calculating distance traveled from a known starting point, using estimated speed and compass heading. Latitude was manageable. Longitude was not. The calculation of longitude at sea, knowing not just how far north or south you were, but how far east or west, required an accurate timepiece, and accurate timepieces small enough and robust enough to function on a moving ship at sea did not exist until the 18th century. Spanish pilots navigating the galleons of the 16th and 17th centuries did so without knowing, with any precision, how far east or west they were. They compensated with experience, with accumulated knowledge of the routes, with the color and temperature of the water, with the behavior of birds and the presence of certain kinds of seaweed, with a feel for the currents and the winds that no instrument could provide and that could not be fully taught, only acquired over years of crossings until the ocean itself became a kind of text that a practiced reader could navigate by recognition rather than calculation. These men were remarkable, and the fact that the flotters made their transatlantic passages with the regularity they did, that the system worked as consistently as it did across the better part of 2 centuries, is in no small part a testament to them. The provisions that sustained a galleon crew across a transatlantic voyage were a subject of careful, if not always successful, planning. The basic ration for an ordinary sailor was built around biscuit, the hard, twice-baked bread that was the staple of maritime provisioning across all European navies of the period. It lasted, in dry conditions, for weeks or months without spoiling. It was nutritionally adequate, if monotonous. It also, in the damp conditions of a working ship, had a tendency to develop weevils, small beetles that infested the interior of the biscuit and were consumed along with it, a fact that experienced sailors acknowledged and new ones found distressing before hunger made them philosophical. Salt fish and salt meat provided protein. Dried legumes, chickpeas, lentils, beans, were boiled in whatever fresh water could be spared. Wine and, later, water mixed with vinegar completed the picture. The fresh provisions taken on at the start of a voyage, live chickens and pigs kept in pens on the main deck, fresh fruit and vegetables purchased in the Canary Islands during the outward passage, were consumed first, within the first weeks, after which the diet settled into its long, unchanging character. Scurvy, the devastating vitamin C deficiency that results from extended periods without fresh fruit or vegetables, was an ever-present danger on long passages, though the Spanish, who typically made land at Caribbean ports before their Atlantic crossings reached the duration at which scurvy becomes critical, suffered from it less severely than the Pacific navigators who spent months without sight of land. Still, the symptoms were known: the bleeding gums, the loosening teeth, the terrible fatigue, the reopening of old wounds as connective tissue broke down. These were familiar enough that they appeared in the medical literature of the period, even if the cause remained poorly understood for another century and a half. Disease was, in general, the great killer of the age of sail. Not combat, not storm, though both took their toll, but the accumulated biological consequences of crowding large numbers of people into small, poorly ventilated spaces, feeding them an inadequate diet, and sailing them through tropical waters where unfamiliar fevers waited at every port. Yellow fever, malaria, dysentery. The Caribbean killed sailors in numbers that the Spanish crown tracked with the same administrative attention it gave to treasure inventories, because losing crews was a logistical problem of the same order as losing ships. A galleon that arrived in Cartagena or Veracruz after a transatlantic crossing was not, by the time she docked, quite the same vessel that had left Seville. She had been worn by weeks of use. Her rigging needed attention. Her hull had been working in the sea. The constant flexion of a wooden ship in ocean swells gradually warped the caulking from the seams, and the pumps that kept a galleon's bilges manageable were in constant use on any long passage. Her crew had been reduced. Not always dramatically, not on a good crossing, but the sea always collected its fee in one form or another. The colonial ports were extraordinary places. Cartagena de Indias, on the northern coast of what is now Colombia, was the primary receiving port for the silver and gold coming up from Peru. The overland route from the Pacific coast, across the isthmus, and down through the mountains, was brutal. Mule trains carrying silver ingots through jungle and over altitude that killed men and animals with similar indifference. But it was, for most of the period, the only route available. The silver that reached Cartagena had already traveled thousands of miles before it ever saw the sea, and it arrived in the city's warehouses in quantities that filled them completely. Portobello, further along the coast of Panama, held its great fair when the floater arrived, a commercial event that drew merchants from across the region that lasted weeks, and during which the buying and selling of goods and the loading of treasure proceeded simultaneously in a controlled chaos that contemporary visitors found almost impossible to describe. The wealth assembled in Portobello during the fair was, by any standard, staggering. One account, from the early 17th century, describes the streets of the town so full of silver ingots that they were stacked against the walls of houses like firewood, simply because the warehouses had run out of room. Havana was the gathering point, the place where the two fleets, the Flota de Nueva España from Veracruz, the Flota de Tierra Firme from Cartagena and Portobello, came together before making their homeward passage. The harbor at Havana was one of the finest natural anchorages in the Caribbean, deep, protected, easily defended by the fortifications the Spanish had constructed on its narrow entrance. Ships that arrived damaged were repaired here. Provisions were replenished. Crews that had been reduced by disease or accident were supplemented with whatever men could be found. The flagship of the combined fleet, the Almiranta and Capitana, the leading and rearguard galleons that carried the fleet's senior officers and the most valuable portion of the treasure, were inspected and provisioned with particular care. Then the fleet sailed north through the Florida Straits, that narrow channel between the Florida coast and the Bahamas, where the Gulf Stream runs swift and blue, and the current adds a knot or two to a northbound ship's speed, and turned east into the open Atlantic. It was in the Florida Straits and the waters immediately north of them that the treasure fleets were most vulnerable. The passage was narrow enough to constrain their options. The hurricanes that built in the Atlantic and curved northwest into the Caribbean tended to funnel through these waters with particular violence. And it was here, on this specific stretch of ocean, that some of the most consequential moments in the Galleon's long history would occur. Moments that would define not just the fate of individual ships, but the trajectory of nations. Moments where the weather or the enemy or simple navigational misfortune would remove from the world treasures so vast that men are still, 4 centuries later, looking for them. The Galleon moved through all of this with her characteristic unhurried authority. She did not hurry because she could not. Her size, her weight, her enormous sail plan, all of it was built for endurance rather than speed, for the long, reliable passage rather than the quick dash. She moved through the water the way a great institution moves through history, with momentum accumulated over time, resistant to sudden change, confident in the weight of what she carried and the legitimacy of the power she represented. And she was right to be confident. For a while, not as a failure of design or intention, simply as a consequence of being great, of being visible, of being consequential, of mattering enough that the world reorganizes itself around you. And in reorganizing, eventually produces the forces that will one day require you to change or to cease. This is not tragedy. It is merely the nature of time, and the Galleon, that magnificent expression of Spanish imperial ambition, was no more immune to it than any empire, any institution, any human endeavor that has ever reached the height of its power and looked out across the world it had shaped. The 17th century was when the reckoning began. It did not arrive as a single catastrophic event, no great battle, no decisive moment after which everything was different. It arrived the way most important changes arrive, gradually, then suddenly, in an accumulation of pressures that individually seemed manageable and collectively proved transformative. The first pressure was political. Spain's dominance of the Atlantic had always depended in part on the cooperation, or at least the paralysis, of her European rivals. England, France, and the Netherlands had spent much of the 16th century either too weak, too distracted, or too legally constrained to mount a systematic challenge to Spanish sea power. But by the early decades of the 17th century, all three nations had developed maritime capabilities that were qualitatively different from anything that had existed before. The Dutch, in particular, had undergone a transformation so rapid and so complete that contemporaries struggled to fully account for it. A small nation that had spent much of the previous century fighting for its independence from Spanish rule had emerged from that struggle with the most sophisticated commercial and naval infrastructure in the world. A fleet of thousands of vessels, a financial system built around the Amsterdam Exchange that could mobilize capital in quantities and at speeds no previous economy had managed, and a merchant class that understood, with extraordinary precision, the relationship between sea power and commercial dominance. The Dutch did not come to the Caribbean quietly. The West India Company, chartered in 1621 specifically to prosecute commercial and military operations against Spanish and Portuguese interests in the Atlantic, was not a pirate organization. It was a corporation. It had shareholders and directors and quarterly reports and a military budget calibrated against strategic objectives. When Dutch forces captured the Spanish Silver Fleet in 1628, an astonishing feat accomplished by Admiral Piet Hein in the Bay of Matanzas off the Cuban coast, the only time in history that an entire treasure fleet was taken intact. The West India Company paid its shareholders a 50% dividend. The age of the freelance sea dog was giving way to something more organized, more systematic, more dangerous. Piet Hein's capture of the Silver Fleet was the shock that the Spanish Empire had always feared and never quite believed possible. 11 million guilders of silver and goods taken without the loss of a single Dutch vessel, the Spanish admiral surrendering his fleet in a humiliation so complete that he was later court-martialed and imprisoned for it. The treasure, when it arrived in Amsterdam, was paraded through the streets. Songs were written about Hein. Children learned his name. In Madrid, the loss was received with something beyond anger, something closer to a kind of existential vertigo. The system that had moved the wealth of an entire hemisphere across 3,000 miles of ocean for a century, reliably enough to build an empire, had been broken in a single afternoon in a Cuban bay. The silver that was supposed to pay the armies of Flanders, to service the debts of the crown, to sustain the entire vast machine of Spanish imperial administration, it was gone. In Amsterdam, paying Dutch shareholders, the Spanish response was to strengthen the convoy system, to build more guardacostas, patrol vessels specifically tasked with policing Caribbean waters, and to fortify their colonial ports more heavily. These were reasonable responses. They were also, in a sense, the responses of an institution that was defending rather than innovating, that was managing a threat rather than transforming itself in answer to it. Meanwhile, the world continued to change around her. The buccaneers of Tortuga and Hispaniola had, by the middle of the 17th century, evolved into something considerably more organized and considerably more formidable than the rough hunters who had first taken to the sea 2 generations earlier. Henry Morgan, Welsh-born, coldly intelligent, possessed of an operational audacity that his enemies found incomprehensible until it was too late, was the figure who defined this evolution most completely. Morgan was not, technically, a pirate. He operated for most of his career under commissions from the English governor of Jamaica, which gave his raids at least the legal framework of privateering. But the scale of what he accomplished went so far beyond the conventional limits of privateering that the distinction began to seem semantic. In 1671, Morgan led an expedition that crossed the Isthmus of Panama on foot, through jungle, over mountains, under conditions of extraordinary hardship, with a force of around 1,200 men, and sacked Panama City. The city was the Pacific terminus of the overland silver route, the place where the wealth of Peru was assembled before making its journey to the Caribbean coast. It was heavily fortified, garrisoned by a professional military force, and considered essentially impregnable from the landward side. Because no enemy force was believed capable of crossing the isthmus in sufficient strength to threaten it, Morgan crossed it anyway. Panama burned for weeks. The silver that Morgan's men could carry, they took. The silver they could not carry, and there was a great deal they could not carry, was hidden by the Spanish in the jungle, or lost in the chaos of the evacuation, or sunk in the bay. Morgan returned to Jamaica, a wealthy man. He was briefly arrested, sent to London in nominal custody, and ultimately knighted by Charles II, who had been negotiating with Spain at the time of the raid and needed to perform some theatre of disapproval, while privately considering Morgan's accomplishment with the same admiration that Elizabeth I had once directed at Drake. The galleons that had been anchored in Panama Bay during the raid, the Pacific Squadron, the ships that connected the Silver Route, were scuttled by their own crews to prevent capture. They settled to the bottom of the bay, in the shadow of the burning city, their cargo dispersed, their purpose defeated, not by a naval battle, but by a land assault that the entire logic of Caribbean defense had failed to anticipate. It was, in miniature, the story of the Galleon's decline, not overcome in the arena where she was strongest, but outmaneuvered, gone around, defeated by an enemy who refused to fight on her terms. The natural world had always been the Galleon's most impartial adversary. In 1715, a fleet of 11 Spanish ships, returning home from Havana, laden with treasure that had accumulated in the colonies for 2 years during the delayed crossings of the War of Spanish Succession, sailed into a hurricane off the coast of Florida. The storm was not unusual for the season. What was unusual was the fleet's timing, driven by political and financial pressures that had pushed the departure date later than caution would have dictated. The hurricane found them in the Florida Straits on the night of July 30th, and by morning, 10 of the 11 ships were on the bottom. The loss was catastrophic in financial terms: 14 million pesos of registered treasure and a considerable additional quantity of unregistered silver that merchants had quietly loaded aboard without paying the crown's tax. The ghost cargo that accompanied virtually every returning fleet as a private supplement to the official manifest, the entire harvest of 2 years of colonial production, taken in a single night by a storm that cared nothing for treasure. Survivors washed ashore on the Florida coast, where they built camps and attempted to salvage what they could from the shallow water. The Spanish mounted a serious recovery operation, sending divers, many of them indigenous Mesoamerican men whose diving abilities the Spanish had exploited for pearl fisheries across the Caribbean, to work the wrecks. They recovered a substantial portion of the treasure. They did not recover all of it. The rest remained, scattered across the sandy bottom of the Florida coast, covered gradually by shifting sediment, forgotten by the empire that had lost it, and remembered by the ocean that had taken it. 3 centuries later, in 1964, a salvager named Kip Wagner found Spanish silver coins washing up on a Florida beach. He had been finding them intermittently for years, single coins corroded green by centuries of salt water, appearing after storms as if the sea were returning piece by piece and at its own pace what it had taken. Following the coins and the historical records and the particular quality of obsession that treasure hunting demands, Wagner located the wrecks of the 1715 fleet. The recovery operations that followed produced, over the following decades, millions of dollars in gold and silver, coins, jewelry, gold discs, pieces of 8-tar, objects that had traveled from the mines of Peru to the Caribbean ports to the bottom of the Florida Sea, and finally into the hands of men who found them in an underwater world that the Galleon's crews had never imagined and could not have conceived. The sea gives back what it chooses, on the schedule it prefers, in the condition it decides. The Galleon herself, as a type, did not die dramatically. She faded. The naval architecture of the 18th century moved on, as architecture always does, toward longer, lower ships, more heavily gunned, more efficiently crewed, with the improvements in rigging and sail plan that allowed smaller crews to manage larger vessels. The great ship of the line that dominated 18th century naval warfare was the Galleon's descendant, in the way that all evolved things are their ancestors' descendants, recognizably related but adapted to a different world, a different set of pressures, a different understanding of what the ocean required. The treasure fleet system itself continued in modified form until the late 18th century, but the floaters of the 1700s operated in a different world than the floaters of the 1500s, a world where British naval power had fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of the Atlantic, where Spain's colonial monopoly had been eroded by decades of contraband trade and military pressure, where the financial system that had made the silver convoys the beating heart of a global economy had been replaced by more sophisticated mechanisms that did not depend on the physical movement of metal across an ocean. The last great Spanish treasure fleets sailed into a world that was already becoming something else, something that the men who had built the first galleons in the Basque shipyards, who had navigated the first crossings by starlight and intuition, who had loaded the first silver onto the first ships in the first Caribbean ports, something that none of those men could have recognized as the world they had helped to create. What remains? This is always, in the end, the question that history asks of the things it has finished with. Not what happened. That can be recovered approximately from the records and the artifacts and the testimony of the sea floor. But what remains? What persists? What the Galleon left behind in the world that outlived her? She left, most obviously, the treasure, dispersed across institutions and collections and private hands. The silver and gold that moved through the Galleon trade reshaped the global economy in ways that economic historians are still measuring. The inflation it caused across 16th century Europe, the price revolution, as it came to be called, altered the relationship between landowners and laborers, between merchants and monarchs, in ways that contributed to political transformations that contributed to the modern world. She left the roots. She left the roots. The sea lanes that the galleons established across the Atlantic, shaped by the trade winds and the currents, by the geography of the Caribbean, by the accumulated knowledge of pilots who had made the crossing dozens of times, were not abandoned when the galleons themselves were retired. They persisted, inscribed into the practice of Atlantic navigation, used by the ships that came after in the way that roads persist long after the civilization that built them has gone. She left the wrecks, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, scattered across the Caribbean and the Atlantic floor in various states of preservation, each one a sealed archive of the world that produced it. The objects carried, the food consumed, the weapons borne, the personal possessions of men whose names are mostly lost, but whose material world persists in the cold, dark, preserving silence of the deep sea. And she left something harder to quantify, a quality of scale, an understanding that the ocean was not a barrier but a medium, that it could be used systematically and repeatedly to move not just people and goods, but the entire weight of an empire. This understanding did not originate with the Galleon, but the Galleon demonstrated it at a scale and over a duration that made it undeniable. Every subsequent maritime empire, British, Dutch, French, built itself on the lesson that Spain had written in silver across the face of the Atlantic. There is a particular quality to late afternoon light on the Caribbean Sea. It comes at an angle that turns the water from blue to something closer to copper, a warm, ancient color that makes the sea look, for an hour or so each evening, like something that has been here long before humans arrived to sail it, and will be here long after the last ship has made its last crossing. Fishermen know this light. Sailors know it. Anyone who has spent enough time on the water knows that this particular hour, this particular color, carries with it a feeling that is not quite melancholy and not quite peace, but somewhere between the two. A recognition of smallness that is somehow not diminishing. The Galleon sailed through this light 10,000 times, perhaps more, 10,000 evenings on the Caribbean and the Atlantic, the sun going down behind the sails, the water turning copper, the pilot checking his compass, the helmsman holding his course. She was, for her time, the most powerful object that human civilization had placed on the ocean. She carried empires. She changed economies. She inspired entire generations of men to risk everything on the possibility of reaching her and taking what she carried. And in the end, she went where all things go, into history, into the sea floor, into the long, quiet memory of an ocean that has held everything humanity has ever placed upon it, and lost, and mourned, and eventually forgotten. Except that we have not quite forgotten. We keep looking, in archives and on sea floors, in the corroded coins that wash up on Florida beaches after storms, in the documentary record and the silences between the documents. We keep looking because the Galleon represents something that we recognize even across 5 centuries. The audacity of building something enormous and sending it out into an uncertain world, loaded with everything that mattered, trusting the ocean and the stars and the skill of ordinary men to bring it home. She did not always come home, but for the better part of 2 centuries, more often than not, through storm and through season, through the age of pirates and the rise of rivals and the slow erosion of the empire that built her, she did. And that, in the end, is what the Galleon was. Not just a ship, not just a fortress, not just a treasury moving slowly through dangerous water. She was proof that the world is crossable, that the impossible distance between here and there can be navigated if you build carefully enough and sail patiently enough and trust completely, without reservation. The deep, indifferent, magnificent sea